1 minute to go. Roisin, when it hits 5:30, do you want to let everyone in? Okay, I'm going to mute myself now.
Yeah, I'll mute everyone and let everyone in.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining and welcome. I'm going to wait maybe another minute or so for folks to come and trickle in. There's some I can see that are still joining us. If you do need technical assistance, you can let us know using the chat function. Okay, I think we'll get started. A couple more people may come on in as we go, but we have some things to start with. So thank you all for being here to the fourth meeting of the Boston Region MPO's Disparate Impact and Disproportionate Burden Policy, or DIDB policy, stakeholder working group. And thank you all for taking the time to join us. I know it's a difficult and stressful time for everyone, but I think our work on this policy is as important as it's ever been to try to ensure that the MPO projects improve transportation for everyone and don't discriminate against our most vulnerable users. So before we dive into the meat of the meeting, I'm going to have Kate White, our public engagement manager, do introductions and a couple of housekeeping things. Kate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Betsy. So I'm just going to read our accessibility statement for everyone joining us here today. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If at any point you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Roisin Foley, our MPO staff member at rfoley@c2s.org, or 857-702-3704. You also probably saw Roisin just waved on her video. We've also made sure to include any questions or technical difficulties in the bottom left-hand corner of the presentation slides. And then I just want to go over some participation guidelines. You all might have noticed as you joined the meeting this evening, all participants are on mute. To speak in this session, use the raise hand function. You'll find this on the participants list, which will show up in your right-hand corner. You can raise your hand and staff will unmute you. For attendees joining by phone this evening, press *9 to raise your hand. So in the breakout sessions, when the stakeholders go to the breakout rooms to discuss in small groups, participants will have control of their muting and unmuting functions. Again, to reiterate, the conversation will be focused on the stakeholders who have participated in helping us shape this policy and who are representing a cross-section of different organizations, municipalities, and MPO seats. And so that's who we'll be primarily focusing on the conversation today. But there will be public comment at the end of the session. So for some introductions, we'd love to introduce the stakeholders. So for those of you who are coming today as a stakeholder group, if you could raise your hands, and we'll be sharing name, what pronouns you use since we're going to be in discussions, what organization you're representing, and I have a fun icebreaker question because I love these kinds of things. And I think today we're going to do your favorite aquatic animal in light of it being awesome whale season in Boston. So I'll start first. My name is Kate White. I'm with the MPO. And I use she, her pronouns. And my icebreaker, or my favorite aquatic animal is turtles, both freshwater and sea. And then Tom, Roisin's going to go through as our host to announce everyone. But again, the stakeholders joining us, if you could raise your hands to help us in finding you, and we'll do introductions.
Thank you. Tom Kadzis, City of Boston, Transportation Department. He, him, and I would imagine, that's a tough one, Tiger.
Okay, great. And I'll go on to the next one. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Ben Muller. I'm with the MassDOT Office of Transportation Planner, he, him, his. And I would have to say scallops, just because they're so delicious.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So I am going to focus first on the stakeholders who are part of the stakeholder group meeting. So Maria, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Maria Foster, she, her, hers, from the Brookline Council on Aging, Transportation Resources Information Planning and Partnership for Seniors. Definitely a dolphin is my favorite aquatic animal.
Wonderful. And then I'll work through the stakeholders and then I'll hop to the staff who are helping facilitate today. So I see also in our participants list, Daniel Amstutz, would you like to go next? There you go.
Oh, sure, that's fine. I'm sorry, I wasn't quite clear whether I was like a stakeholder as an MPO member, but my name is Daniel Amstutz. I'm at the town of Arlington. I'm the senior transportation planner. My pronoun is he, him, and I was thinking of one, but actually I think I really prefer octopus.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, so I see next, I'm gonna go in alphabetical order. I see next Jay Monty, who's also part of the group. Jay, I'm gonna unmute you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Jay Monty from the City of Everett, Transportation Planner. I just joined, I don't know if we were doing some other icebreaker activity here too. I just dialed in, so.
Oh yeah, no, what pronouns you use since we're gonna be in discussions, and our icebreaker is favorite aquatic animal.
Oh, okay, he, his, him, and aquatic animal, turtle, sea turtle.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So going next, and for those of you who just joined, we're gonna introduce all the stakeholders who are part of the stakeholder group who've shaped the policy. Next in line, we have Johannes. I'm gonna unmute you, Johannes. Do you wanna share your name, organization, pronouns, and favorite aquatic animal?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Johannes Epke. I am a staff attorney at Conservation Law Foundation. I use he, him, his pronouns. My favorite aquatic animal, I think somebody already said dolphin, but I'm going with it just because they're so darn smart.
Yeah, I think same animals totally works in this setting. So next we have Christiana. I'm gonna unmute you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Great. Hi, my name is Christiana Lacusa. I work at Livable Streets Alliance, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. My favorite aquatic animal. I really love this question. So many to choose from, but I would say whales.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So next in line is Len Diggins. Len, I'm gonna unmute you. Would you like to introduce yourself? See, I just unmuted. There might be some, I'm gonna try again. And Len, if there's any technical difficulties, I can make sure to come back to you. Okay, we'll definitely work on that. I'm gonna move to the next person in line. We have Scott. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Scott Sudeikis with Crosstown Connect TMA, as well as a vice chair of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council for the MPO. I'm he, him, his, and a couple of mine already got taken, but I think I'm going to go with narwhal, even though that's in a type of whale.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much. So next we have Cheryl. Cheryl, I'm gonna unmute yourself. Unmute you.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Leary. I represent HESCO Elder Services and Aging Service Access Point in the Area Agency on Aging in South Norfolk County. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I think for my favorite aquatic animal, I have to go with the otter. They are just gosh darn cute.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So let's see, I think, oh, okay, perfect. Len, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Great. Yeah, okay, thanks. Sorry about that. I mean, I was doing it on phone on the porch feed, and I think it was just interface problems on my part. He, him, his, although sometimes feeling like an it. I'm representing the Right Oversight Committee, MBTA, Right Oversight Committee, and aquatic animal. Well, Dan said octopus. I mean, I kind of like that because I need more than one brain. But let's go with lobster, because as someone said, they just taste so good.
Awesome, thank you so much, Len.
Sure.
That's perfect. Okay, so now we'd love to introduce some of the staff that are joining us. We'll have a couple other stakeholders from the stakeholder group joining soon, so I'll make sure to introduce them then. So next, Roisin, would you like to go first?
Sure. My name is Roisin Foley, MPO staff. She, her, hers. And I don't have a particular favorite aquatic animal, but it would probably be something that lives like very deep in the ocean, like in the Marianas Trench, that we've never seen before, that has like a light bulb on its head or something.
Like a very specific anglerfish or something. Okay, wonderful. Annette, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks, Kate. Annette Dempster, MPO staff, she, her, hers, and I hate to be repetitive, but dolphin is my number one.
Hey, I think repeats work. So next, Emily, would you like to go?
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a member of CTPS or MPO staff, and she, her, hers are my pronouns, and I'm going to go with the blue whale.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So Jonathan, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Jonathan Church, manager of MPO activities. My pronouns are he, him, his, and my favorite aquatic animal is orcas.
Awesome, thank you so much. Stephen, would you like to go next?
Hi, my name is Stephen Andrews. My pronouns are he, him, his, and my favorite aquatic animal is a crab because they're so darn pinchy.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then next, should I do Tegan and then Betsy for staff? Sound good? Okay. Tegan, do you want to go next?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Sure, and do I get to take a couple extra minutes? Just, do I get to take that liberty at this point? Okay. So my name is Tegan Tyke. I'm the Executive Director of Central Transportation Planning staff to the Boston Region MPO. She, her, hers. And just to start, my favorite aquatic animal is hands down stingrays. They are like velvet and very playful and adorable and really fun to interact with, as long as you avoid the stinger. So with that, I wanted to just take a couple of moments to sort of echo Betsy's welcome to you all for the 4th workshop for the DIDB stakeholder group. I do like to try to say right off the bat and just sort of remind folks that, we are CTPS, we are staff to the Boston Region MPO, and we do have two primary roles that I think it's just useful to emphasize. And one is that we, of course, support the Boston Region MPO board. I know a number of you are here today, and I thank you for that. And of course, the board has a vision to create a transportation system that supports a sustainable, healthy, equitable, and economically vibrant region. And it also has the goal to do that through a transparent, inclusive process. And these kinds of conversations are an important part of that. But we also carry out a wide range of technical work and planning studies that support our partners in the region, including Mass DOT, the MBTA, municipalities, amongst others. So we really do try to engage with a very wide range of stakeholders in the region. And I think I know most of you on the participant list, but for those of you who don't know me, I've been involved with the Boston Region MPO board for about 5 years now, the first 4 as a member, because I was at the time chair of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council, which Len is now the chair of, and will be represented here today by Scott. But in October, so I was involved as a board member, I was involved in the first 3 workshops. So I participated in these conversations as a stakeholder. But in October, my role shifted and I became the executive director of CTPS. And I'm actually just very excited to be on this side of the table at this point so that I can now support staff in having this discussion with you about how policies affect how we can meaningfully incorporate equity into MPO planning and programming. One thing that I think is helpful to bring to the table as well is just the clear connection between these conversations and actual real significant investments that are made in the transportation system, because I think it can be easy to lose track of the real sort of outcomes of these kinds of conversations. So I just want to summarize that in the state of Massachusetts, MPOs, the Boston MPO being one of them, allocate about $250 million of federal funding to transportation projects that they themselves select each year. That's about 1/8 of the total state investment in transportation projects from all federal and non-federal state funding sources. But even at 1/8, it's a really important chunk because it's a chunk that the MPOs can allocate based on the specific goals that they think are most relevant for our specific regions. So in the Boston region, that's about $110 million per year, prioritized for projects that reach towards this goal to create a sustainable, a healthy, a livable, and equitable transportation system. The MPOs also get planning money, and they also have to approve any funding used in the region, any federal funding used in the region by MassDOT and MBTA. So the MPO conversations are not just important from a policy perspective, but also in terms of real projects that end up getting built. And I hope I don't have to tell anyone this, but I just think it's worth saying that the transportation system and the way it has developed has negatively affected people with lower incomes, people of color, and just vulnerable populations of all kinds. And over time, that inequitable impact has only exaggerated the negative effects on marginalized populations in terms of their health, how safe they feel on the streets, quality of life, and of course, access to opportunities like jobs and healthcare and other things. And of course, those inequities can only be reversed if we really turn ourselves to actively focusing on reversing them and investing in marginalized populations. So I wanted to emphasize that because I know that when I was on this group, this working group, I questioned the efficacy of this specific DIDB policy and its ability to really undo such deep systemic injustice in our communities. And we had a number of conversations around that. But I do want to say that, Betsy really helped me understand during that time and since then that this is one of many tools that we have to support the MPO in understanding equity and the impacts of its works on equity, and also to think about addressing equity impacts. And so Betsy will remind you and keep you grounded, she's great at that, about how this policy, what it is specifically intended to accomplish within that bigger picture. So I just kind of want to remind you that she may pull you back to that. However, that said, we know that this policy does not do everything. So I really just want to actively invite you all to continue to engage in sort of ongoing deeper conversations with staff here about how equity can and should be considered and addressed beyond even the DIDB policy. And already those conversations have had an impact on the work that the MPO does. For example, we're working with the MPO to update the criteria used to select capital projects. And we're updating them in a way that will now incorporate equity far more meaningfully than it has been in the past, or so we believe. So I guess my ending comment is please keep it coming, even if you feel like it might be a little outside of what this policy can do. Please keep it coming and talk to us all about your thoughts. And I look forward to the conversation today. And thank you for giving me the liberty of a few extra minutes. And Betsy, I will turn it back to you. Or Kate, actually, whoever it is next.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tegan. And, you know, Betsy, you'd love to introduce yourself. And just to reiterate to everyone, we want to introduce all the stakeholders who are part of the stakeholder group, as well as all the staff who are helping facilitate this session. We'd love if you want to, you know, throw in your name, organization, and pronouns and aquatic animals in the chat for all those who are joining us. And again, we wanted to make sure you all knew who was helping facilitate this session. So Betsy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate, and thank you, Tegan, for that really great introduction. My name is Betsy Harvey. I am on the MPO staff and run the Transportation Equity Program, and I'm going to be facilitating most of today's conversation. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and my favorite aquatic animal, as many on here already have said, is the dolphin. So, Kate, do we have any more introductions we need to make?
No, at this time we are set to go.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, we can move into kind of the meat of today's meeting. We have just finished our welcome and introductions, and we will be moving in a moment into the DIDB policy, where I will be talking about the context in which the DIDB policy resides within the broader equity work that the MPO does, and then talk about the recommendations that we would like to make to recommended changes we'd like to make to the existing draft DIDB policy. And then following that, we will have a small group breakout session of about 30 minutes for stakeholders. And then we will report back as a larger group and discuss what everyone discussed in their small groups. And we will have time for public comments at the end. So hopefully folks who are here representing outside of the stakeholder group will have some input and feedback that we'd like to hear as well. And then we'll wrap up and conclude with our next steps. I do want to point out that Kate will be occasionally posting links in the resources that I mentioned in the chat box, so you may want to leave it open. And you can find that chat box at the bottom of your screen. The main goal of today's workshop is to gather feedback from our stakeholders on the changes that we recommend to make to the MPO's existing draft DIDB policy. We developed that policy after the last working group meeting in 2018 and used it for the last long-range transportation plan, Destination 2040, which was completed last summer. So we've been working on revising it since then and would like your input before we ask the MPO to endorse the final version of the policy this fall. The final policy will allow us to determine when our projects in the long range plan, or LRTP, as a group would likely disproportionately affect people of color or people of low incomes, and making that determination is required by Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration. And so developing this DIDB policy will allow us to do so in a transparent and consistent manner. In addition, we hope to illustrate the benefits and drawbacks of using different thresholds that make up the policy. So it's so folks can understand how we got to our recommendation. And then finally, we want to show how the policy fits within the MPO's approach to equity more broadly. As Tegan mentioned, it is only one tool in a toolbox, and we want to help folks understand the bigger context. So before diving into the recommendation, I do want to start by providing some context for the DIDB policy. We try to incorporate equity into everything that we do at the MPO. We have an overarching equity goal and accompanying objectives that are in our long-range plan that we develop every 4 years. Our current goal commits us to identifying and addressing transportation impacts of vulnerable populations, setting the framework for how we approach equity agency-wide. Through our Transportation Improvement Program and our long-range plan, we try to fund projects that would benefit our most vulnerable populations through robust project selection criteria. And then we also have the DIDB policy and analysis, where we analyze those projects that we'd like to fund as a group to make sure that the impacts wouldn't disproportionately affect people of color and people with low incomes, resulting unintentionally in discrimination. And throughout all of that work runs our public engagement, where we work with stakeholders and talk with folks from all backgrounds across the region to hear their priorities and give them the opportunity to meaningfully shape the transportation system in our region. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention the other equity work is because while the DIDB policy is a powerful tool, it is narrow in its scope, which limits its role in moving us toward an equitable transportation system. And that's why it's so critical that we do effective public engagement, that our goals and objectives are clear and grounded in the realities of vulnerable communities and their experiences, and that we're funding projects that have benefits for these communities. More specifically, the DIDB policy only covers projects that change the capacity of the transportation network. That means a project that removes or adds an extra lane on a roadway or adds a new rail line where there wasn't one before. And you can access a link in the chat box to the projects that we fund in the last long range plan. And you can see which ones we analyzed. The impacts that we analyzed as well are aggregated over the entire region. We have 97 towns in our region, so it's pretty big. So that means that places with very high CO emissions, for example, those are averaged out with areas with lower levels of CO emissions. So this analysis does miss those hotspots. We're also not analyzing the impacts of individual projects as they're analyzed as a group. We analyze projects individually when we are picking them and deciding what to fund in the long range plan. And finally, and this is really important, when we're analyzing impacts, these are ones that we expect will exist in the future, 20 years out, because that's the scope of our long range plan. So we don't address existing impacts with this particular policy. So while this isn't the tool for that, we do have other ways in which we can do that, like through project selection and the Transportation Improvement Program, which is our short-term capital plan that covers the investments in the upcoming 5 years. So I hope the main takeaway with this particular part of the presentation is that the policy is one of several tools that we can use to move us toward a more equitable transportation system and ensure we're not unintentionally discriminating in the projects that we fund, but it isn't our only tool. So with that said, you might be wondering, then what does it do and how does it actually help us address equity? As I mentioned, we are required by the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration, from whom we receive funding every year, to prevent unintentional discrimination, or as they call it, disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens. And our policy identifies potential future impacts of the projects in our long-range plan and determines whether those impacts would disproportionately affect people of color or people with low incomes. Now, it also acts as a check because we've aligned our equity goal with the goal of the DIDB policy. So we can look to see if the projects that we're funding in the long-range plan will help us to meet our equity goal. Hold on a second. So if we do find a disparate impact, the MPO has to decide how to address it. Federal guidance requires us to either avoid, minimize, or mitigate disparate impacts, which means we can either avoid them altogether or minimize them through the projects that we program in our long-range plan, or mitigate them through future project investments in the future. So now that we have that background, I want to move on to the staff recommended changes to the existing DIDB policy.
Betsy, really quickly before you do that, there's a weird like clicking sound on your end. Do you know what that could be?
I don't. I turned off my AC unit. I don't know if that helped.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep moving then.
You can try not using my headphones.
Maybe.
Let me know if this is any better. Technology,
it is so far.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, as I said, I want to move into the disparate impact policy and the changes that we'd like to make to the policy. So I'll be referring in a few moments to the DIDB threshold application, and there will be a link in the app that you can, or sorry, a link to the app in the chat box, which you may want to open if you haven't already, because I'm going to be referring to it in a few slides, and we'll be using it in the breakout groups. My hope is that it'll help you to better understand the policy and to better provide input effectively. So as I mentioned, we had done some stakeholder meetings a couple of years ago to get initial feedback on how we should approach developing the DIDB policy. We had a series of 4 meetings, and as out of the last meeting, the stakeholders, you gave us a couple of kind of things to think about, things to pursue, and recommendations going forward. And I just wanted to summarize what those are. You encouraged us to go ahead and use a measure of model uncertainty to screen out unlikely impacts, since as a forecasting tool, the travel demand model that we use in this analysis doesn't perfectly forecast the future. And we want to focus on those results, those impacts that are most likely, and that is a feature of the current draft DIDB policy. You also asked us to provide detailed model results in the LRTP DIDB analysis in Destination 2040, our most recent long-range plan, which we also did. And then you also asked us to provide more information by which you could determine when an impact is practically significant. And I'll get a little bit more into what that means in a moment, but basically what it means is when an impact is is significant, when it's impactful to a population. And so that is something that we have decided to pursue, as you'll see in a moment. So since then, we've done a bunch of work since that meeting in response to those recommendations. During the winter of 2019, we worked on identifying the uncertainty in our modeling process. We incorporated that into the current draft policy, and the MPO approved the use of that policy for Destination 2040 in May of 2019. In October, we began a study to address other outstanding stakeholder questions. And we finally are here at our fourth working group meeting. And we hope to have the MPO endorse the final DIDB policy and wrap up the study in the fall. So that brings us to our policy recommendation. We propose that the policy consists of 3 separate thresholds, each of which must be passed in order for us to find a disparate impact or disproportionate burden. The first is the baseline uncertainty threshold, which tells us whether there would likely be an impact by accounting for uncertainty that's inherent in travel demand forecasting. The second threshold would be what's called a practical impact threshold, which tells us whether the impact would be significant. For example, whether a 30-second increase in travel time would be significant. And the third threshold is our disproportionality threshold, which would tell us whether the minority or low-income population would be more adversely affected than the non-minority or non-low-income population, for example. So basically what the policy would test is, would there be an impact? And if so, would the impact be significant? And then would the EJ population be more disproportionately affected than the non-EJ population? So I want to take a moment to look at the thresholds a little bit more closely. As I mentioned, the model cannot predict with perfect accuracy the impacts of transportation projects. So we need to make sure that we look at impacts that are likely, as opposed to those that are really a result of the noise in the travel demand model. For example, if we have two groups, one in blue where the range of likely travel time, which is the area under the curve, is small, and then a group in orange where that range is much wider. So as you can see with group A, there's really not much overlap. So we'd be more confident that there's a difference between the scenario where the projects won't be built and the projects where they would be built. So we would be pretty sure that there's an impact there. With group B, there's a lot of overlap between those two scenarios. And so we'd be a lot less confident that there's an impact. And we want to make sure we're identifying impacts that are likely. So only if we're confident that there would be an impact would we want to move on to the next threshold, which is the practical impact threshold. The concept behind this one is to determine when an impact is significant. For example, how much of an increase in travel time is too much? Is it a minute, which is the case for group A, or is it 2 minutes, the case for group B? But remember that these impacts are an average for the entire population across the region. And to account for the different types of metrics that we analyze, so for example, pounds of carbon monoxide emissions or travel time in minutes, we analyze this as a % change in whatever impact we're looking at for that metric. And finally, we come to the disproportionality threshold, which determines when the minority or low-income population would be more adversely affected than the non-minority and non-low-income population. Here, group B would experience a 1 minute greater increase in travel time. And this threshold would tell us whether that difference, the 1 minute difference between the two groups, is discriminatory. So now that we have that, I want to go to the DIDB threshold application. Trying to bring my window to the front. Here, give me a second. There we go. Okay, so hopefully if you can access the link in the chat box to the DIDB threshold application, and I'm going to give you a brief tour. The app allows you to change each of the thresholds that I mentioned to see how it would affect the indication of a disparate impact or disproportionate burden. So the first tab is the introduction tab, which just basically tells you the purpose of the app and how to use it. These other 3 tabs, the accessibility, environmental metrics, and mobility metrics tabs, allow you to look at the different metrics from the last long range plan and see what would happen if you change the threshold to different values. You can change the metrics that you're looking at by choosing one in a drop-down menu. I want to look at the environmental metrics tab, and we'll look at the carbon monoxide emission metric. You can set different threshold values in the sidebar, and each of these thresholds has its own chart that reflects the values that you set. We have the baseline uncertainty chart at the top, followed by the practical impact and disproportionality charts at the bottom. We can change the baseline uncertainty threshold with these radio buttons, which represent the confidence that we have that the model is representing future impacts. No uncertainty means that we think future impacts will be exactly what the model predicts. A high uncertainty means that we think the future impacts are within a range around the model's prediction, but we're uncertain as to what where the actual value would lie. The width of the bars in the baseline uncertainty chart reflect the uncertainty set with the threshold. The wider the bars, the more uncertainty we have of where the value actually is. Bars that don't overlap indicate a potential impact. If they do overlap, it indicates there likely isn't an impact. The practical impact threshold can be changed with a slider in the slide bar as well. We can change it, and it will, and the gray area in the chart will change to reflect that value. If the impact to the population is greater than the threshold, the bars state whether it would be a benefit or a burden to each population group. If at least one population shows an impact that exceeds the threshold, then we would move on to the third threshold, disproportionality threshold. Again, the disproportionality threshold value can be changed with a slider and a sidebar. And the size of the gray area will change to reflect the threshold set with the slider. And the bars state which population would be affected more, such as benefiting more or having more burdens. There's also a table at the bottom of each tab that states whether there would be a disparate impact or disproportionate burden. In the second column from the right, and then to the right of that, it states why that would be the case. And finally, at the results for all metrics tab, it shows the results for all of the metrics using the thresholds that you set. Again, look at the two columns to the far right to tell you whether there would be a disparate impact using those threshold values and the reason for that. Okay, I'm gonna move back to my computer screen, all right, PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so you'll have a chance to kind of use that a little bit more, I think, during the breakout sessions in a few minutes. But I just wanted to give you access to that, and hopefully that will help you visualize a little bit the sorts of thresholds we're talking about and how they could result in potential disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens. So when we were thinking about what thresholds we wanted to set, we considered a couple of different things. We wanted to think about the risk of having false negatives, where you'd say there isn't a disparate impact when there really would be one, and false positives, where you say there is a disparate impact when there really wouldn't be a disparate impact. So what we want to do is weigh those consequences, where lower threshold would mean we want to err on the side of finding some disparate impacts where there likely wouldn't be any. But a higher threshold means we err on the side of missing some disparate impacts that are likely to occur. We also thought about the importance of the impacts in the context of other benefits and burdens. Having lower thresholds means the MPO may have to make changes to projects it funds, even though some projects may offer other benefits that could make them worth funding. And finally, we want to think about MPO resources. We want to use our resources to address disparate impacts that are likely, and recognizing that there's a lot of other equity work that we want to do that would have a more immediate and direct impact on current inequities and addressing those in our transportation system. Having a lower threshold would increase the likelihood of finding a disparate impact that may not occur, which could potentially mean that we draw resources from other equity work that we do. So we've come up with a policy that we think is logical and balances those considerations, consistent with federal guidance, and addresses concerns raised by the stakeholder group and the public, and kind of meets our goals and values in MPO when it comes to equity. For the baseline threshold, we would like to set that at moderate uncertainty. And we think that this reflects what we can expect from the model and the metrics that we analyze. For the practical impact threshold, we want to set that at 0%. As I've mentioned earlier, you did encourage us to go back and see if we could find a compelling and evidence-based reason as to why this threshold should exceed 0%. In other words, why we should say that any change is insignificant. And that was the main focus of the study that we're completing this year. We've done an extensive review of literature for each of those groups of metrics, the travel time, and accessibility metrics, and environmental metrics, but didn't find a compelling reason to set the threshold above 0%. Lots of research has been done on the impact of, say, travel time or carbon monoxide emissions on individuals, but translating those impacts to 3 million people with very different exposures levels and travel behavior is very difficult. And so we felt that by setting the threshold to 0%, we are taking into account the fact that some places do have higher exposure levels than others. And finally, we would like to set the disproportionality threshold to 0%. We heard from you at the last meeting that you didn't want the policy to allow any difference in impacts between the minority and non-minority and low-income and non-low-income populations, and we agree with that, and so that's why we're recommending that. So we've kind of come to the end of the presentation portion of the meeting. And we're going to take some time now, about half an hour, to break out into small groups for half an hour. And each group will have 2 staff members, one to facilitate the discussion and one to take notes. One stakeholder from each group should plan on reporting back afterwards to the entire group on what you talk about. And so we have a couple of discussion questions to help frame these discussions. Well, each stakeholder has been assigned to a group already, and in just a minute, you will be let into your rooms. And for folks from the public, you have a few choices. You can stay in the main room with Roisin and Tegan, who will be available for discussion of these questions if you want to talk about them or anything related to equity or the MPO in general. If you want to take a break, that's totally fine too. Just be sure to be back in a half an hour around by 6:45. It's 6:15 right now. You'll also all be unmuted, so just please remember to mute yourself if you're not talking, just to keep excess noise to a minimum. We have 4 questions that can help frame discussions for the next half hour. If you spend all your time on one question, that's totally fine. It's more of a, let's kind of start the conversation, and if you want to get through all of them, that's great too. The questions are, what is your reaction to the recommendation and why? What are benefits and drawbacks of preventing false negatives and false positives? What could the implications be of false negatives and false positives for the MPO and the public? And then discuss potential strategies for addressing disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens. So I know that's a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment, and you'll be able to see the questions, I believe, when you break into your groups. So
I'm gonna go ahead and send people to their groups, unless Betsy, you have anything else you wanna say? No?
Nope, that's great. We'll meet back here in a half an hour at 6:45.
So like Betsy said, if anyone who is here representing an agency that's not on the stakeholder group and wants to talk about these questions that Betsy was talking about, you can feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. And if you want to go get a glass of water, go to the restroom, take a break for the next half hour, you're also welcome to do that.
Hey everyone, I know it's been a few minutes since everyone broke out, and as far as I know, people may be all muted. But I just did want to invite folks, just if you do want to discuss any of the questions that were put forward in terms of your reaction to the recommendation, or the idea of worrying about false negatives or false positives, or other potential strategies for addressing disparate impacts, we'd certainly welcome that conversation if you'd like to have it. And if you would prefer to sort of, again, take your break and wait for the stakeholders that have been engaged in this conversation to come back from their groups and have that conversation, then that is also okay. So I will put myself back on mute and allow you all to either raise your hand using the participants window or type a message into the chat if you'd also like us to try to address anything. And it looks like Roisin just put the questions again into the chat box if you want to see them. But no pressure to participate, we're just here if you want to. I see Greg, so I'm gonna unmute. Hey, Greg.
Yes, hi, hello. How is everybody? I'm actually just wondering if anybody has had an opportunity to test out the Thresholds web page. I'm going through it now, trying to look at some of the potential results with different levels of thresholds. And I'm not sure that it's working properly for me, especially when I look at the results for all metrics. I'm seeing instances in the table where the table is indicating, for instance, that an EJ population is burdened more by a proposed change, by a proposed investment, yet it's still labeled not as a DIDB. I suppose that could just be because that final threshold might be too high, but I just wanted to make sure that the table was working properly for everybody.
That's a good question. It's a little hard for me. So what you're saying is that something that you think you're seeing in one of the tabs, like the environmental metrics or otherwise, when you look at the final table and the results for all metrics, it's not flagging it as a yes, for whichever issue you identified. Is that sort of what you're describing?
Correct, yes.
Okay. That's helpful to know. I do believe there's been some testing, and certainly the groups are testing it right now. So you can either I'm happy to just sort of mention that when everyone comes back in, or Roisin can mention it to Betsy and just ask whether others have that issue. And I'd love to make sure that we try to address it if there's a glitch in there somewhere.
Okay.
So I appreciate, I appreciate you flagging that for us. I do think this is a really interesting tool. Go ahead, Roisin.
Sorry, just Emily, who built the app, is in one of the breakout groups as a facilitator. But she'll be back and she can probably address it.
Yeah. So we will make a note of that. Roisin, if you don't, I will try to remember to bring it up. But thank you. I'm glad you're testing it out while we're sitting here.
Yes. No, it's a well done tool. I like it.
Thank you. Even more of a reason to try to work out any glitches if there are any. Okay, I'm gonna put you back on mute, but feel free if you have other things that you want to add on, just let us know.
Okay, great, thanks.
So I just gave the folks in the breakout groups a 5-minute warning. So they should be back pretty soon. So if you do want to get a last minute snack or restroom break, now's your time.
All right. I think we're all back, hopefully, and I know some people are just stepping out to get water. So, so thank you. I hope everybody had a productive conversation. I know my group was, and you got some of your questions answered and provided some feedback. We have about 20 minutes or so to have a broader group discussion. And I want to start that off by hearing from each of the groups, each of the 3 breakout groups, and then also, you know, if there's anything, Roisin or Tegan, that you wanted to address from any of the members of the public who hung out with you, or not, that's okay too, but give you that chance. So I'll start with my group. Ben generously volunteered to provide some report back for us. So if you want to go ahead, you'll be unmuted.
Sure. Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, voluntold, I think is the word, but let's see. So there were some questions about how the current proposal will address the limitations that Betsy outlined at the beginning of the DIB-DB analysis, sort of as part of the greater equity framework. It sounded as if those limitations would continue, but the other sort of supporting equity work of the MPO sort of buttresses this effort, and this informs those efforts. There were concerns about the potential for the baseline uncertainty to sort of end the potential for reflection at the beginning of the process, just by showing too much uncertainty too early, I suppose. There was appreciation expressed for avoiding too many false DIB-DB flags. And something I thought was interesting was there's a proposal for sort of a tiered public outreach approach, where, you know, if there's sort of a light red flag, but a lot of uncertainty as to whether that was a meaningful impact or not, you know, potentially a light touch public process could help inform that. Whereas if there was sort of more, through the tool of more potential impacts were expressed, that would sort of signal a more aggressive public approach. So I thought that was interesting. There were questions about how the MPO staff are updating the model to be more informative to this process and sort of to other processes and to better reflect the impacts of projects. And there was appreciation that this tool wouldn't actually change the outcomes of the last RTP so much, just given the sort of the macro nature of the transportation system and how few of the projects are included within the RTP. And so sort of just noting that impacts would be limited from a change to the policy, but appreciating making sure that the policy is more reflective of sort of our values and goals as a region.
Thanks, Ben. Let's move on to Annette's group. I don't know who would like to volunteer to speak for them.
Thanks, Betsy. Can you put up the questions again?
Sure.
No? Okay, great.
Give me a second.
Thanks. Decided at the last minute that I was going to do this. Okay, so
no worries.
No problem. And so
they're also in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you should be able to see them.
Okay, there we go. So our recommendation to our actions and recommendations were overall positive, and so essentially we have to discuss this a bit. And after I kind of was pushing for a lower uncertainty threshold, understood the wisdom of having it at moderate, especially since we're going to have the other two thresholds at 0, and then understanding the consequences of getting those flags. And there is the hope and desire, that there will be work done, before the final analysis where we can maybe tease out some of the potential flags and maybe even tease out projects that might be a little problematic. You use that with a small p. And so yes, the benefits and drawbacks of preventing false negatives and positives, you pretty much pointed those out, in your discussion. And so we want to err on the side of preventing false positives, especially since so much work is done beforehand, and that we have other ways of trying to create projects that increase equity, and the implications. Yeah, I pretty much answered 3 just there. And so our strategy for the potential impacts and disproportionate burdens, was a kind of humorous one where we would bring the modeler out and publicly flog them for not having a good model. But other than that, we didn't really get to that point a whole lot. Thanks.
Thanks, Len. That may be
Sure.
problematic, but okay. And then Stephen's group.
So we have Scott giving our share back. Do you want me to unmute you, Scott? Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't seem to be able to unmute myself. So yeah, we spent a lot of time kind of looking at what would be our ideal kind of like settings within the threshold tool, and the practical impact versus the disproportionality. We had kind of mixed answers, but I think, there were definitely, we don't necessarily want a lot of false positives or negatives. Obviously, we want a balanced approach, but there was a pretty general consensus that the transportation system is already quite, unequal, and our group had the feeling that we want to come at it from that view. So like, there's already big impacts on groups, that have low incomes or, minority groups. So essentially coming at it from that, setting the threshold at 0 would make the most sense, because projects should not increase an already unequal system, essentially. And then we kind of talked about, if there was something that was flagged as being a disproportionate burden, it's kind of a awkward place to be if you're saying like 1% is okay. That's sort of codifying disproportionate impact, and that also is not a desirable outcome. So we wanted to, we also looked at kind of how, what we thought would be good if a project were flagged, as impacting one population more than another. And, we wanted to, obviously not just defund the project and move on, but, have, learn from past projects, or, just think about how you can remedy this project so that you get back to that sort of 0 threshold. Let me see if there's anything else. So yeah, it was a little bit more technical discussion on thresholds, and the general view was at all costs not really adding any more inequity to a society and transportation system that is already unequal. I think that's about it.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. I just wanted to give Roisin or Tegan, who were in the back in the main room, if there's anything you wanted to bring up.
We didn't really have much of a conversation. I think most people took the opportunity to take a little break, but I know Greg did have a question about the app.
Yes, I can address that. So if I'm understanding correctly, Greg, your question was whether, like how, with the app and each threshold, when is a disparate impact triggered at which point along the three thresholds, along the three different steps, and only if a disparate impact would be found only if a impact was found to be likely with the first threshold, was found to be a significant impact with the second threshold, and then was found to disproportionately and adversely affect the EJ population at third threshold. So it has to pass all three thresholds in order for there to be a disparate impact. If it passes the first one and not the second one, there wouldn't be a disparate impact. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. Yeah, I think that the confusion that I was having was that in looking at the kind of output from the tool, you see instances where, given the proposed thresholds, you could see a scenario where there could be a practical, a difference in the practical impact. There could be a difference in the disproportionality from one population to another, yet because of the kind of certainty or uncertainty measure being significant enough, those wouldn't be identified as potential disparate impacts. And so yeah, now having that clarification that it is in fact all three measures that would need to be used, that certainly helps. Thank you.
Sorry, I was unmuted. No, that's a great question, and that they come up with our group as well, kind of a related question about the order of the thresholds. And I mean, if you do, if you said, if you found, if you do the uncertainty threshold last, so you're looking at first if it's an impact and then whether it's disproportionately affecting the EJ population, you might be missing out on that information that you would get about that metric, because you're if you're kind of not going as if you're kind of cutting it off after if it's too uncertain, if that makes sense. Ben said it much more clearly than I just did, but yeah, that's definitely something that has also been brought up. And we did initially look at having it as the second, the uncertainty threshold as the second threshold. But felt that it seemed to make the most sense to kind of do it in the order that we proposed for it. But certainly, if anyone feels differently, certainly like to hear it.
So Betsy, if you want me to jump in, we see that Len. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't so much that, Betsy. I mean, if I'm getting ahead of you, just hold me back. Hey, but I would want to hear what people felt about that fourth question, because even though I gave a humorous response to it, I mean, I'd like to hear what people think we should do if we did find something that popped out that gave us a flag.
And just a reminder to anyone, if you want to share, just raise your hand and we'll be able to easily unmute you. Thank you, Jay. I'll unmute you now.
One of the things we talked about in our group was trying to get a real world feel for how the model is going to respond to different scenarios. I think a lot of us felt that the MPO is doing a lot, the CTPS is doing a lot now already to try to reduce disparate impacts on low-income minority populations, and we don't really have a feel just from doing a scenario looking at our current LRTP or even an LRTP a few years ago, kind of how to calibrate the model, that it might be worthwhile to create sort of a fictional long-range plan, or even look at one. One of our group members brought this up, we'll get something historic from like 50 years ago, where we know there were some really major projects that had some really major impacts and many negative impacts in some cases, and see what this thing does, see how this this system responds to it, so that we really get an idea of like what do these thresholds mean? What does a plan look like that's going to show up having a lot of disparate impacts, and one that may not? Because I think it almost feels like we're working around the edges here a bit, where given all the other efforts we're doing, we're probably not going to find horrible disparate impacts. I mean, I hope we wouldn't. Maybe we will, but we have a great public process. We have a great system of looking at projects. We've, in most cases, probably weeded this stuff out. I think it's one thing to say we're going to do this for Federal Highway because it's what's being required of us. But if we genuinely want to know, is this model effective, I think we need to kind of push its limits and see what makes things stand out and what doesn't.
You ever thought of becoming a modeler, Jay? I mean,
I'm good. I got it off my plate.
those are definitely questions that I've had conversations with the modelers about, and are interested in understanding the sensitivity of the model. What happens if you change different kind of inputs, such as either it's tolls or ridership, or you kind of what your data inputs to see what would happen. So that's kind of one side of that analysis, that sort of analysis. It would be great to know like what happened 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. The model changes a lot. It does change over time, is what I'm saying. Is between 30 years and now, technology has improved. We have improved data. We have improved various aspects of how we do this work, as we do in all transportation planning. So making that comparison might be difficult, but I think it's it's certainly an intriguing thing. And
I think even a fictional project, I mean, let's just for the sake of talking about this, what if we built today the Inner Belt Highway, right? Like we were going to plow through Cambridge and build a brand new interstate. What does that look like on here? Is it like, because to me that should be like, the needle should be like breaking off the scale on disparate impacts, right? And so, to see that, like if you took that as one project amongst a bunch of other projects that we're doing today that are much less impactful, how does that, like you said, the sensitivity, right? How does it affect the outcome based on the sensitivity of the model? So maybe it's just something we invent something that we're never going to do, and we have no intention of ever doing. Just to understand how this model is reacting, and I'm not a modeler, so I don't know what. There's probably a lot that goes into that I'm not accounting for, but that's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be doing scenario planning in the next couple of years for the next long range plan. And I think that will hopefully get at some of what you're suggesting, is what happens if we test these different scenarios. What that looks like, we have, is beyond kind of outside of my area of work at the MPO, what exactly those scenarios would be, but that's certainly one thing that we can think about of, how we want to set up those scenarios to potentially answer questions like that.
Okay, great. Well, Tom, we see your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask a question. We also have some staff on hand if they want to address any of the model questions.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, no worries.
Well, Len had asked, and I shared Len's curiosity with well, what do you do? What do you do if you find impacts? And that's a damn good question, Len. I don't know what you do, because it's all relative. You could revisit the design, but what are you looking at and within what context? It's almost as if the question would be, well, is it the right project? What project isn't being advanced? What project isn't being under consideration? It might be, and I hope that's not a cop out, but I'm not too sure what you do other than what you do is you'd probably get some people who can objectively exercise subjective judgment to review what the results are for the disproportionate disparate impacts. But it as much gets to what projects are, maybe what projects aren't on the board. And a lot of that gets to, well, what's the life cycle of a project? What's the genesis of a project? How's this stuff start? And that's as important as anything, because then you're gonna get a project that may be more suited for a specific population area. Or that would be the outcome that could be one of the outcomes of this impact analysis would be, well, it's highlighting a problem, a gap or something. If that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Ben, I see your hand next. If you want me to, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Great, thank you, Kate. Yeah, Tom, those are exactly the sort of the things I was thinking about. When we're doing, just for folks who don't know me, I'm in the Office of Transportation Planning. I help with the capital investment plan at times at MassDOT, and some of the ideas we're grappling with are like sort of this, this what if we had invested, what's the most equitable investment scenario? And we have a lot of data limitations that kind of limit us from measuring that. We don't really have full data on all of the project universe out there of potential projects we could program. And so there's not a good way for us to say that, we could invest in this, but we decided on this program instead. But it is something that we're starting to identify and work with, especially as we increasingly digitize our project identification process. And so that might be, an area of investigation for the future. So look at what projects are in the universe of potential projects for the RTP and how do those impacts shape out compared to what projects were selected. And on the same note, we're looking at where in the process we perform our equity analysis. Because I know as anyone who follows MassDOT will know that we kind of put our analysis out right at the very end after the public process, which limits its ability to inform our project selection. Because of course, if we run an analysis that says this is inequitable, but we've already gone through 6 months of picking the projects, it's unlikely that some of those are going to change. It's just to inform the next year. So I think that's sort of an outstanding question of like where in the process of RTP development this DIDB analysis would run, whether it's sort of at the end after everything's wrapped up or sort of earlier in the process to kind of inform iterations of project selection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a next step for the MPO to think about and, well, frankly, decide on. I think that would be ideal. It's something that has been mentioned in the past previous MPO meetings to be able to do that, do this earlier in the process. I do want to make sure, this is a great conversation. I want to make sure though that we give opportunity for the public to give any comments at this time, and we can kind of circle back to any remaining questions after that. So if you are a member of the public and you want to have any questions or comments, raise your hand and Kate will unmute you.
Betsy, I did see that Marty had raised his hand. I don't know if we wanted to acknowledge him.
Of course, Marty is one of our staff. Can we just make sure the public comment comes in? I know he wants to comment on some of the modeling, and we can circle back to that. I just want to make sure to give members of the public a chance.
And just a reminder for anyone to raise your hand. You just click on your participants list. It's in the lower right-hand corner. And then by the signal of the raised hand, it lets us know to unmute you. And if you're joining by phone, you can press *9.
I don't see any members of the public, so we'll go to Marty, and if anyone, feel free to raise your hand again, and we'll call on you, stakeholder or otherwise.
All right, hi. I guess the first thing I wanted to say, can you hear me okay? Good. Is for non-modelers, you guys are really thinking about models the right way, you know, and like wanting to represent a scenario that you know would have a great negative impact and then use that as your reference point. That's just how we should be approaching this. So I came in just about 6 months ago to the agency, and you know, Betsy and Andrew and Emily kind of brought me up to speed on this work. And this is really cutting edge work to try to capture that uncertainty that we have that's implicit in the model inputs and the model parameters and the structures. So it's really great that we're moving in this area, but I think, you know, now we're understanding like, okay, we introduce uncertainty to it. We need the context because it's, you know, the model is just kind of driving in the way that we're telling it. So we want to, I think these suggestions of these other kind of reference point scenarios are really great ideas. And Betsy raises a great point too, that it, like, we can't go back to previous models. I mean, the software, you know, forget about it, like DOS and previous is what would be required. But we could implement things in our current model structure, right? Like draw that line of the inner belt and see what happens. And I really like that idea. And I guess the last point I want to make is to kind of talk about the exploratory modeling effort that we're making now, which is sort of like our precursor to scenario planning, where we're trying to get that better understanding of the model sensitivity and walk across a range of things. And so here we're going to be kind of getting into more details of, rather than just saying here's a range of uncertainty, we're going to say here are the components of that uncertainty, and then understand more how the input ranges are related to certain output ranges. And then we can kind of make decisions based on that as well, of like, okay, well, this is an input that, yes, we have a lot of uncertainty about, versus this other one, not so much. Let's not worry about that. And then let's see, you know, whether we are still seeing that significantly different you know, response in the model, or if it's basically the same thing within the noise. Len, we'll make you a modeler yet, don't worry.
Thanks, Marty. I know a couple other folks who want to unmute them.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks, Marty. I mean, I came and I spent like 2 hours, maybe 3, with Betsy and a couple other folks. You know, it's really great to understand how the modeling was done and how many times, I mean, how much you changed the values for the various metrics. I mean, and then look at a large number of outputs before you settle on a number. So I have a lot of respect for the process. I mean, and that does kind of fit in a bit with what Jay was getting at. But I really wanted to respond to Tom, because the complication, you know, with the problem with getting a flag, as Annette pointed out to us, is that it is a set of projects, meaning that we are running that model on. And so it's not really evident what project is the problem, or if it's a combination of projects. And so I really support Ben's idea of doing this analysis earlier on in the process, where we can do perhaps different combinations of projects in a model run. It can be along the lines of scenario planning, and even within a given scenario, running a couple of different combinations of projects. And from that, maybe we can tease out what projects are potentially problematic, when we reduce the uncertainty to a much lower level than we might use when we do the final equity analysis. So that's it. A bunch of stuff, but just comments and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Len. So Johannes, we see your hand up, so I'm going to unmute you now.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a question about something that came up in our breakout group that we didn't really have time to dive into, and that's the idea of negative values for the thresholds, specifically the third threshold for disproportionate burden or disparate impact. You know, a negative value, recognizing that the transportation system is currently inequitable and that this policy isn't intended to fix past harms, it's really future and forward looking. I'm wondering if a negative value for that third criteria or that third threshold was considered to push the transportation system in a more equitable direction, rather than just ensuring that we're not continuing to move in a bad direction. Is that something that was considered, or are there practical considerations there that I'm not considering?
It's a good question, and we did not consider using a negative value. The purpose of in thinking about it kind of right now, the purpose of the policies reflects what the feds have set out for us to do, which is determine when an impact is significant and unintentionally discriminatory. And it's a hard question. How do you define discrimination, right? I mean, it's not something that I think most of us feel comfortable doing, because it's a hard conversation to have, but critically important, but in terms of, for obvious reasons, of making sure that we are serving everybody and ensuring that everybody has access to transportation and is not disproportionately affected in the ways that they have been for so long. I guess my reaction is that it may not meet that particular kind of federal guidance. I'd have to think about it more to see if that's something that would be appropriate for the MPO. And it's not to say that it isn't something that like a concept that couldn't or shouldn't be implemented by an MPO in some regard, right? I mean, I think what you're getting at is kind of reversing decades-long systemic discrimination in our transportation network, and adverse effects that have been around for too long. But I'm just not sure that this is exactly that tool to do that with. But I do appreciate very much the kind of the intention behind it, and I can think more about it and see where that sort of approach might be appropriate in the broader context of the equity work that we do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Johannes. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to provide or ask, or provide any public comments? Okay, wonderful. If anyone at any moment starts to think of anything, just let us know by either raising your hand or chatting us in the chat box. So I think, Betsy, we'll move on to the next section.
Yeah, so that pretty much wraps up our meeting today. So it's good timing. We have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to wrap up with a few kind of next steps and other ways that you can continue your involvement with MPO activities if you'd like to do so. I want to first give Scott Zadakis a chance to say a few words about the Regional Transportation Advisory Council, which he is the vice chair of and is representing today. He can talk a little bit more about why that is a potential avenue for folks to join if they'd like as a member or not as a member, but either way, they're certainly looking for folks to join the group. Scott, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you.
Hey, okay, thank you so much. So yeah, I just want to briefly talk about the Transportation Advisory Council. So the MPO, has its, voting members and a general body, and one of the voting
members on that group is our chair, Len Diggins. So what the Transportation Advisory Council does, Regional Transportation Advisory Council, is we're made up of organizations throughout the region that the MPO covers. And it can be private or public, nonprofit, really doesn't matter that much what kind of group. We have a lot of municipalities that are members, and we're also looking to build on those municipalities because, you know, we've got some, but we'd like to have more. And essentially what we do is we talk about things like this. We look at different plans that are coming out of the MPO and kind of weigh in with our opinions. We meet once a month and just talk about, you know, whatever the plans that are coming out of the MPO might be. I'd say probably the biggest things that we do weigh in on are the LRTP, sorry, I'll stop using acronyms, the Long Range Transportation Plan, the Unified Planning Work Program, which is the UPWP, and the TIP, or the Transportation Improvement Program. Those each, you know, come up once a year, and we write letters kind of indicating any concerns we have with them, or any advice that our group would have that coming from kind of the outside of the MPO. And so we've got some of our members. I'm from Transportation Management Association. We've got advocacy groups that advocate for you know, pedestrian or biking. Like I said, we have municipal members that are kind of coming at it from that side of, or from that perspective. And so I just wanted to extend an invitation to anybody who would like to, who represents an organization, who would like to, you know, even just come to one of our meetings and sit in on it and see what we're all about. You can find our information on the MPO, or actually, I don't know if it's in, yeah, it's on the MPO website, but also CTPS, Central Transportation Planning Staff website. And you can, like I said, come to any one of our meetings. That we'd be happy to have you. It really doesn't take a whole lot to become a voting member. We welcome members of the public, but we also really would like to grow our voting membership. And as far as I can remember from the bylaws, I believe you only have to come to 3 meetings within a 5-month period or something like that. And then we can vote you into the group, and you can have a vote within our group, and then we have a vote on the MPO. And so just wanted to extend that invitation to anybody who wants to weigh in on issues like this or others in a more, you know, in a more regular way. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That's great. Kate posted some contact information about if you would like to be involved with that in the chat box, as well as the website. Also, just in addition to that, we are updating the criteria with which we choose projects to fund in our capital investment, our short-term capital investment program, the TIP. We're aiming to wrap those up in early October, so we're still accepting any feedback. If you haven't provided any already, that information is also available on our website. And we're looking forward to that, and those are one of the most direct ways in which we can kind of address equity and improve how the projects that we fund and make sure that they are benefiting more vulnerable populations. And just as a reminder, we do have MPO meetings every first and third Thursday of the month. If you'd like to join those, they're all on Zoom. And we're always eager to meet with folks. If you want to meet with Kate or I, or both of us, kind of on Zoom or any other online platform, you contact her or myself. We're always happy to meet with advocates or anyone really who wants to talk more in depth about the MPO and equity and transportation planning more generally. So that's all that I have. As I mentioned, we will be looking to wrap this up in the fall, the MPO endorsement of a policy, and we will let you know when that happens. You can also expect a follow-up survey from Kate shortly, so that to reflect on the meeting today and provide any feedback for future meetings. So if you could fill that out, that would be wonderful. Anyone else want to add anything from staff?
I just wanted to thank Betsy for all that information, and thank you everyone for joining us. We just shared some of the links in the chat. So if you want to check anything out, so the Regional Transportation Advisory Council, if you want to learn more about the TIP and TIP criteria, if you want to check out our calendar about upcoming meetings, all of that's in there. We'll also include it in the post-event or post-meeting email. But again, all our contact information will be there. So if you want to be in touch with us at all, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yes, definitely. And just thank you all for participating. This has been a really productive and great process. And we couldn't have done it without stakeholders and the public and all of the staff here at MPO, who many have worked on this in various ways. I think the vast majority of staff have contributed to this work in the past 3 years. So it's been a real treat and real pleasure working with people and learning how to do this along the way. So I just want to say thank you and hopefully see you all in some capacity soon. So bye, everyone.